Now that we looked at the first UI form, let's take a short detour via the CSS for the app. I chose to go with CSS as it's much easier for tutorials. I can use sources instead of multiple screenshots to explain an idea. The first selector is a constants selector. It lets us define theme constants. Here we include two basic values that most apps should include. Include native bool indicates that we want the theme to derive from the native theme as a starting point. This is essential as it defines a lot of important things such as the spacing on top of iOS devices, etc. The scroll visible bool constant hides the scroll bars that might show in some OSs. Pop-up dialog appears as an arrow dialog in iOS, but other OSs don't implement it. The pop-up dialog is used in the sign-up process for picking the country of SMS verification. The background color of the pop-up is white and implicitly defined as opaque. We have a subtle rounded corners with a radius of 1 mm on the dialog. You will notice zero margin as the dialog touches the edges, but 2 mm in padding, which space the content a bit from its edges. Label is pretty standard, so I won't spend too much time on that. It's just a 2.5 mm light font. Multiline 1 is used to describe the first line of the multi-button. There isn't much here, just a light, slightly larger font. The one thing to notice is the zero padding on the bottom, so the first line and the next line will be close together. Multiline 2 is pretty similar to Multiline 1. Only with a slightly smaller font. Notice that the blue color of the text is derived from the native theme and isn't declared here. Also notice the 1 pixel gray border at the bottom of the multiline. Multiline 3 and 4 have zero padding and margin. This removes potential errant spaces from the list of buttons. The whole multi-button is styled here to have a white background with no margin or padding. Notice that border is explicitly defined as none. This is important as the multi-button contains a line border in some native themes that would collide with the shorter border we want in this case. The toolbar defines the background in the top of the form. We give it a 1 pixel bottom border, which is pretty similar to the border defined in the native app. It's very subtle. When styling the title, we should usually style the commands as well, so they have similar proportions and alignment. Subtitle represents the 4 buttons below the title. They are similar but have an off-white color, are slightly smaller and are center aligned. Toggle buttons use the press state to indicate selection, in which case we want them to be white. The subtitle underline is the animated small thin white line below the buttons. This draws the full content of the component. Chat form uses the image as a background image. Notice the source DPI 0 argument, which means we don't want to use multi-image for this specific case. This just sets the color of the floating action button. We use the text field in the sign-up form. It's added by the SMS activation CN1 lib. There's nothing special about it. However, the chat text field is a separate component. It uses a pill border to wrap its content. Technically, this is a container that traps the actual text field, but it's still perceived as a text field. The icons within the text field are just simple font image icons with a specific color and very little margin. The text field hint is just gray text for the text field. And the record button has round border similar to the floating action button. Nothing special other than a bit of padding and margin to position it properly. Chat time represents the hour next to the message within the chat bubble. It's just gray and smallish. We make sure it's transparent so it can work on white or green backgrounds. The same goes for the chat text with larger black font. It's still transparent for the same reason. The bubble of the chat is implemented in code as a custom border. I thought about using a 9-piece border, and this seemed like a better option. I use margin on the right side to prevent the bubble from going too deep into the other side. This seems close to what WhatsApp is doing in their app. The same is true for chat bubble right, with a different color and direction of the margin, which is now spaced on the left side. The command list is the style of the overflow menu. I use box shadow, which unfortunately produces a 9-piece image border. Hopefully the CSS support will improve and use round rect border for this in the future. Notice there is a subtle border radius CSS attribute that rounds the corners of this dialog. Each entry here is a command. They have a simple 2mm padding with light font style. The last style is day. It maps to the day label, marking chats in a specific date. We use the pill border with a bluish color. With that, the CSS is done.